In this episode, I'm going to be interviewing my friend Kyle Miller. He was prior Air Force, and then he transitioned over to the Coast Guard. So he did a full 4 years in the Air Force, then he transitioned over to the Coast Guard. So in this video series, I'm going to be interviewing him, asking him a bunch of questions about the differences of the Air Force and Coast Guard, giving you guys a nice, well-rounded, and kind of larger scope idea of the two different services and what you can expect in each. So stay tuned. Hey, welcome back, Military Journeyman. If you're new to this channel, my name is Julian Sage Miata. I'm an active duty Coast Guard member and real estate agent in the DMV. My goal for this channel is to help you along your military journey by giving you the best military tips and money-saving hacks. So consider subscribing so you can keep up to date. So I'm starting a new series where I'm interviewing people that have transitioned from their prior service over to the Coast Guard, because there's a lot of people that actually transition from like the Air Force, Marines, Navy, Army over to the Coast Guard. So I want to highlight these people and talk about like what are their experiences doing a full tour in their prior service, and then also their experience of working a good amount of time in the Coast Guard and getting kind of that nice well-rounded experience. So without further ado, this is going to be a series. Please enjoy and leave your comments for Kyle or myself in the comment section, and we'll try to answer as many of them as possible. Welcome back, Military Journeyman. In this episode, I've got my coworker, my good friend, Kyle Miller. Kyle is a prior Air Force, served in the Air Force previously, and then he transitioned over to the Coast Guard. So I wanted to make this episode special for you guys because there is nowhere on YouTube talking about Air Force versus Coast Guard or people that transition from the Air Force. So very cool. He's got a lot of experience. He's been in the service now for what has it been, like 10 years now?
9, almost 10.
Nine,
We're
almost
almost
10.
10.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, well, without further ado, I'm not going to drag on this introduction, but Kyle, would you mind letting the Military Journeyman community know a little bit more about who you are and what inspired you to get into the Coast Guard?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Kyle Miller. I used to be prior service Air Force. So I did 4.5 years as a satellite systems operator for missile warning. My AFC was 1 Charlie 6. I did my 4.5 years there. Didn't really want to pursue a career in the Air Force. Had difference of opinions on certain things, and I honestly did not enjoy some of the time that I had there. So I was looking at joining different services, and actually my supervisor was like, "Hey, why don't you join the Coast Guard?" I was like, "I can do that. I can transfer over to the Coast Guard." He's like, "Yeah." I was like, so I looked into that. I went to a recruiter, and after that, came in. My mindset was like I was going to be maintenance. I was going to do machinery technician. But when I got in, one of the things that I didn't really realize is how they do their operation. So in going through and learning, I actually switched to IT. And ever since then, I've been doing, I've done another 5 years IT. So
now, I think what is really cool that I want to let the audience know is that you were technically a Space Force person, right?
Yes. Actually, my job will be, if it does transfer, which they are in the process of doing, will transfer to the Space Force. So one of the cool things that I brought with me when I transferred is I'm actually kind of a unicorn in the Coast Guard community. I actually have a space badge, a space pin that I'm allowed to wear on certain uniforms.
Yeah, that I was really surprised, and when we had a uniform inspection, all the other commanders and officers are like, "What is that thing?" And you're like, "Oh, I'm Space Force."
Yeah.
Very cool. So, I mean, obviously, you transitioned from the Air Force to the Coast Guard because of some differences in your thought. What was it that you didn't like about the Air Force? Being out of the Air Force now, you can obviously kind of talk about these things. What about the Air Force was it that didn't really suit you?
There's certain things in the aspect of the Air Force life that I didn't quite agree with. And one of the big ones was how if you're not in school the entire time, they kind of frown upon that. And they want you, and it's no fault. Like, it's a great thing that they do that. It's just that like to constantly be doing that, juggling school, work, and home life. It was really very difficult. They wanted you to maintain a certain style, and if you didn't maintain that, they frowned upon it a little bit. Um, so that on top of the fact that I actually didn't enjoy my job as much. I enjoyed it for what I did. I loved the experience that I got from it, but I started wanting to do something more than just what I was doing.
Now, I think with the Air Force, there's kind of, when you think about the military branches, you always think like Air Force is just super, super kind of more challenging to get into that, and also the Coast Guard. What did you think was a little bit more challenging, getting into the Air Force or getting into the Coast Guard?
They each brought their own challenges to the table. I mean, like when I was in the Air Force, schooling was very important, and my job, like if I failed 2 tests, I was out. I'd have to pick a different job. And so it was a little challenging and mentally in that aspect of making sure that you're always constantly on top of your game, on top of your studying, knowing your job inside and out. So in that aspect, it was more job oriented rather than military, military was right next up, knowing everything about the military, but they wanted you to know your job more.
Now, obviously, it sounds like are all the schools like this in the Air Force? Are they all super kind of strict on high requirements like tests?
A lot of them are, and they're getting a little bit more serious. But during the time that I was in, no, they were strict on making sure that you passed, of course. But I mean, the difference here is like I was actually doing rocket science for my job. So it was a little bit more challenging in the mental aspect of that, like the study material. But I mean, like, yeah, there are certain jobs where there's like security forces. If you don't pass certain things, you can't do that job. I mean, like if you can't get down how to like, I mean, read somebody their rights as you're arresting them on base, that's kind of a big deal. So yeah, there's different aspects in different jobs that cause you to fail if you don't do it properly. But I think my job was maybe a little bit more intense, which is like there was one more above us where it's like if you did even remotely one thing wrong, you failed because it was very dangerous. And I believe that was like working with nuclear weapons.
So your job is kind of like was it kind of like an air traffic controller, like that type of pressure?
No, it was more. No, it was more of missile warning. So I worked on satellite systems operations with missile warning. So I worked on the satellites that dealt with Cerberus and DSP, which would watch to see if there were any missile launches within the world.
Now, I'm sure we could talk probably a long time about all this stuff, but I want to start just by kind of going over the beginning. Boot camp for Coast Guard and Air Force. What is the what was your experience with Air Force boot camp versus Coast Guard boot camp? I know in my videos I always kind of make fun of the chair force, kind of give them that kind of reputation, but probably from ignorance, I don't know much about the Air Force boot camp. So would you mind kind of explaining what have been the big differences that you saw having been through both?
Having been through both, some of the biggest things are like the Air Force was very big on your knowledge of just basic military operations. They were big on PT, but the biggest part of PT was more of the run. They were big on making sure that you were able to run within a certain amount of time that they allotted. I know that like the standards for the PT test are different between the two, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, with the Air Force, it was kind of similar in how they do things and the mental capacity of knowing your stuff. I know that when I came in, I don't know, it seemed it's very kind of difficult to explain if you haven't done it. Air Force, every morning PT was the biggest thing. And then after that, it was just classes all day long. with PT, like sessions in the middle. Whereas Coast Guard, you had a minor PT session in the morning, but then you also had physical training with weights. Air Force does not have that. It's all body weight. Whereas Coast Guard decides like you get to go into the gym and actually pump some iron also while doing a run or a cycling to get up your physical endurance and everything. So that was one of the huge differences. Knowledge base, I think Coast Guard had a little bit more because they wanted you not only to know the military aspect, but also like your sailing aspect, like being able to tie knots, being able to know where to be for battle zones. Another thing that I actually was able to do when I went through is when they had Beast Week for the Air Force. Now, Beast Week is like a mini deployment series that we got to go and see what it was like to be deployed by building tents, acting as post guards for a military base installation that's really small, and going through sea Bernie training at the same time. And then after actions for when, like, if your base gets hit, the different things that you have to do, staying away, posting guards, everything. It's like, it was really kind of cool. And I was very sad to hear that they took that away, honestly.
So you thought that Beast Week was kind of like the enjoyable part of Air Force boot camp?
In my opinion, yes, I actually did enjoy it. There are others who are like, this is the dumbest thing in the world. But I was like, it gives you that small experience of what's to come if you're within that job line. Like, it's actually a good thing to have, in my opinion. Gets you set up for a little bit more success.
Now, what about the incentive training, the beat sessions? People, I don't know why everybody gets so upset when I say beat sessions, but the IT training, throughout the Coast Guard, throughout Coast Guard boot camp, there'd be like in between classes, you'd have IT sessions where your CCs would come in and they'd, be like, someone was looking at the wall and they weren't supposed to be looking, and everybody would get a session. Does that happen in Air Force boot camp?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, you were doing one thing wrong, everybody got punished. It was one of those, and I totally agree with these sessions, because one of the biggest things that it teaches you is that it's ever changing and you never know when like bad things are going to happen. So it's like, it gets you ready for that intense moment of, I mean, shit hit the fan. You need to be ready. You need to know how mentally to let go of everything else and get on task right there and know exactly what to do. And so these sessions give recruits that drop what you're doing and get to what you need to do, get to your battle stations, get to what you need to do, and keep the knowledge that you have ready to do it. And so when these sessions happen, it gets them to that aspect.
Now, so compared to Air Force versus Coast Guard, just kind of giving your thoughts, what do you think was more physically demanding?
Oh, I'm definitely going to say Coast Guard was definitely more demanding because, like I said, Coast Guard uses weights. Air Force does not. Air Force, you're using your body weight. So you're doing push-ups, you're doing squats, you're just doing repetitive actions over and over and over with just your body weight. Whereas like the Coast Guard, they have Medusa, which is this big long line of rope that's for like mooring up ships. So it's kind of big. And so they would fake that back and forth, and you'd have to raise this over your head while keeping it all together in 3 different positions, back and forth, just continuously for couple of minutes, like between 5 to 15, depending on the severity of the situation. And if you weren't doing anything physical, they're going to make it longer because they know you can handle it. Another one they have, it's the pipe filled with sand, and it's the same concept. It's just heavy, stiff. So the difference there is like just a solid piece versus a wobbly piece that just keeps falling apart that you have to keep together. So it's like they change it out.
Now, what about the frequency of the sessions? Did you find that in the Air Force or Coast Guard, which one had them more often?
It really depended on the day, to be honest. Like I remember there was some times where Air Force would get you. There were some times where Coast Guard would get you more. But if I had to choose, I think Coast Guard actually did a little bit more in the end. Just because like there was always time to do PT.
And what about the stress level? What did you feel was more stressful in the current situation?
That's going to be a challenging question for me to answer for a lot of people because I grew up military. So my mindset was very different from those who have never been in the military aspect. I would say that Coast Guard might be a little bit more intimidating in that sense because I just remember like a little bit more of one-on-one time with the CCs because in the Air Force, you have a difference of hundreds of people going through versus just 100. So I believe that Coast Guard is a little bit more intense.
And what about academic, like the amount of knowledge that you're required to know?
It's about the same. If like maybe Coast Guard has a little bit more because you have to know how to tie, you have to know your day-to-day operations, like who's in charge during the day and stuff like that. Whereas Air Force didn't really have that. It was more of know your CCs, know your chain of command. And that was really that. I mean, you had the officer of the day, but you never really had to know exactly who it was because there was like multiple different officers of the day for different locations on the base.
And so for your overall experience, if you could go back and redo a boot camp, which one would you choose to do?
Oh, I'd do Coast Guard. I loved it.
You do Coast Guard boot camp over Air Force boot camp, even though from what it sounds like Air Force was not as challenging.
Oh, absolutely. One of the other things is like because I had gone through basic training with the Air Force, I had another better understanding of what the CCs or the MTIs go through and what they're dared to do. So when I went through Coast Guard, there were moments where I would just be standing around and I would actually try and make it harder for myself because I know what they would be doing. Like there was one time where I did something wrong on purpose. Not like that was devastating to like, this is going to cause a real problem if you do it in the field. It was more of like, I was standing in formation and I looked over at the CC and then I looked back just to cause a little bit more friction.
No, it's very, very interesting that you choose to go through Coast Guard boot camp over Air Force boot camp. And now kind of transitioning from this, so we finished our boot camp experience. Let's talk about your first unit in the Air Force versus in the Coast Guard. Hope you guys liked this video. If you did, give it a big thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already. If you want to keep watching and you want to see the full series of this interview, check out right here or keep watching right here. Until next time, peace out.